I should have known that a man who collected beautiful things would eventually try to add my granddaughter to his collection. Those words still echo in my mind as I sit here at 74, watching the morning sun filter through the lace curtains of my Boston brownstone. My name is Eleanor Whitfield, and I've lived long enough to recognize the subtle patterns of evil when they dance back into your life wearing a different face. Before I tell you what happened next, I want you to stay with me. Subscribe if you haven't already, and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. It warms this old heart to know where my words travel. It was at Emma's gallery opening that I first saw him again. 23 years had passed since Vincent Ashford had swept into my world like a cultured hurricane, charming his way into my heart, and then systematically dismantling my late husband's art collection. But there he was, silver-haired and distinguished, studying my granddaughter's paintings with the same calculating intensity I remembered from 2001. Imagine standing in a room full of art and spotting the one person who once shattered your life. What would you do? Emma was radiant that evening, her auburn hair catching the gallery lights as she moved between guests, discussing her work with passion and intelligence. At 28, she had inherited her grandfather's eye for beauty and her grandmother's business acumen. What she hadn't inherited was my hard-earned skepticism about men who spoke too eloquently about art and love. "Grandmother Eleanor," she called out, her voice bright with excitement. "I want you to meet someone special. This is Alexander Pemberton. He's interested in commissioning a series." The name was different, but everything else was achingly familiar. The way he held his wine glass just so, the slight tilt of his head when listening, the practiced pause before speaking that made every word seem carefully chosen and therefore precious. Vincent Ashford had aged into Alexander Pemberton, but the predator's grace remained unchanged. "Mrs. Whitfield," he said, taking my hand with both of his in that gesture of manufactured intimacy I remembered so well. "Emma speaks of you constantly. Your wisdom, your strength. She clearly adores you." I studied his face, searching for any flicker of recognition, but found only the polished surface of a man who had spent decades perfecting his mask. "How lovely," I managed, my voice steady despite the ice forming in my chest. "And what sort of commission interests you, Mr. Pemberton?" "Something personal, intimate. I believe great art should capture not just beauty, but the essence of human connection." His eyes moved to Emma with what appeared to be genuine affection. "Your granddaughter has a rare gift for revealing the soul beneath the surface." As the evening progressed, I watched Alexander work the room with surgical precision. He knew exactly which questions to ask each guest, which compliments would resonate most deeply. When he spoke to the elderly collector Mrs. Hartwell about her late husband's passion for impressionist paintings, his voice carried just the right note of shared loss. When he discussed emerging artists with the gallery owner, his knowledge was impressive but not overwhelming. But it was his attention to Emma that made my blood run cold with recognition. He didn't dominate her conversations. Instead, he created space for her to shine while positioning himself as the perfect audience. He asked about her creative process with genuine curiosity, complimented her insights without overshadowing them, and somehow managed to suggest that her success was inevitable while implying he'd love to be part of that journey. I had watched Vincent employ these same techniques on me in the months after Charles died. The way he'd made me feel seen, valued, cherished at a time when grief had left me invisible to the world. The careful balance between admiration and space, pursuit and patience, that made his eventual betrayal feel like my own failing rather than his calculated crime. This next part will hit you like it hit me, a phone call that turns your stomach upside down. 3 weeks later, Emma called me with news that made my worst fears feel prophetic. "Grandmother, I have something wonderful to tell you. Alexander and I are engaged." The teacup slipped from my hands, shattering against the hardwood floor of my kitchen. "Engaged? Emma, darling, you've known him less than a month." I know it sounds sudden, but when you find your soulmate, timing becomes irrelevant. Her voice carried that breathless quality I recognized from my own infatuation decades earlier. "He understands my art, my dreams, everything about me. And the way he looks at me, grandmother, like I'm the most precious thing in the world." I closed my eyes, remembering how Vincent had looked at me the same way, right up until the morning I discovered my husband's entire collection had been sold to private collectors, the proceeds transferred to accounts I couldn't access. Where will you live after the wedding? That's the beautiful part. Alexander has this amazing estate in the Berkshires. He wants me to have a proper studio, space to create without the distractions of city life. He says he's going to take care of everything so I can focus entirely on my art. Ever notice how manipulators reuse the same script? That's because it works, until someone recognizes the lines. The isolation, the financial dependence, the romantic narrative that masked complete control. Vincent had used the same script, convincing me that selling Charles's paintings was about creating a fresh start for us, somewhere we could build our own legacy without the shadow of my late husband's memory. Emma, I think we should talk, in person. Of course. Alexander suggested we have dinner this weekend. He's so eager to get to know you better. That evening, I sat in my study surrounded by the few pieces from Charles's collection that I'd managed to save. A small Monet that had been in storage during Vincent's raid, a sketch by Degas that he'd overlooked, a contemporary piece by an unknown artist that he'd deemed worthless. Each painting was a reminder of what I'd lost to a man who collected beautiful things the way other people collected stamps, systematically, passionlessly, for profit rather than love. But this time was different. This time, I wasn't a grief-stricken widow making decisions through a fog of loss. This time, I was a woman who'd spent 23 years learning to recognize manipulation in all its sophisticated forms. The dinner was held at Alexander's Beacon Hill apartment, a study in understated elegance that reminded me painfully of Vincent's aesthetic. Museum-quality pieces lined the walls, each positioned to create maximum impact. As Emma gave me a tour, I noted the absence of personal photographs. The careful curation that suggested everything was chosen for effect rather than sentiment. "Grandmother, look at this Cezanne," Emma said, her voice filled with reverence. "Alexander acquired it last year. Isn't it extraordinary?" I studied the painting, my art history training from decades past stirring uneasily. Something about the brushwork seemed off, too confident in places where Cezanne had been tentative, too refined where his later work had grown deliberately crude. "It's certainly striking," I said carefully. "Alexander has such an incredible eye," Emma continued, slipping her arm through his as he joined us. "He's been collecting for over 20 years. His expertise is why I trust his advice about my career." "What sort of advice?" I asked, accepting the glass of wine Alexander offered with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Notice how he starts reshaping her dreams, not by tearing them down, but by gently redirecting them. Well, for instance, he thinks I should focus exclusively on private commissions rather than gallery exhibitions. More intimate relationships with collectors, better financial stability." I felt the familiar chill of recognition. Vincent had given me similar advice, gradually separating me from the art world networks that might have questioned his methods or offered alternative perspectives. "That's an interesting approach," I said neutrally. During dinner, Alexander regaled us with stories of his travels, his acquisitions, his relationships with artists and collectors around the world. Each anecdote was perfectly crafted to demonstrate his sophistication while reinforcing his authority. When Emma mentioned wanting to exhibit in New York, he gently redirected the conversation toward the advantages of building a more select clientele. "Mass exposure can actually damage an artist's market value," he explained, his tone professorial but kind. "The greatest painters in history built their reputations through patronage, not publicity." As the evening progressed, I watched Emma absorb every word as gospel truth. Alexander had positioned himself not just as her fiancé, but as her mentor, her guide to navigating the art world she'd been successfully managing on her own for years. The subtle undermining of her confidence was masterful, wrapped in compliments and concern, delivered with the authority of experience and the tenderness of love. After Emma excused herself to take a phone call from her gallery, Alexander and I found ourselves alone for the first time. "She's remarkable," he said, refilling my wine glass. Such talent, such dedication, but also such innocence about the business side of art. Emma's actually quite savvy, I replied evenly. She's built her career entirely through her own efforts. Of course, but there's so much she could achieve with proper guidance. The right connections, the right strategy. He leaned back in his chair, studying me with those calculating eyes I remembered so well. I imagine you understand the importance of having someone to navigate life's complexities. After your husband died, you must have felt quite overwhelmed by the decisions you faced. The reference was casual, almost throwaway, but it sent ice through my veins. He knew. He'd always known who I was, just as I'd known who he was from that first moment in the gallery. I managed well enough, I said, my voice carefully controlled. I'm sure you did, though I understand you had some difficulties with your husband's collection. Art fraud is unfortunately common in estate situations. So many unscrupulous dealers taking advantage of widows who don't understand the market. The audacity was breathtaking. He was describing his own crimes while positioning himself as the sympathetic observer, even suggesting I'd been the victim of someone else's deception. It was a master class in psychological manipulation, acknowledging the truth while reframing it to serve his narrative. Yes, I said quietly. It's amazing how people you trust can turn out to be completely different than they appear. Our eyes met across the table, and for just a moment the pretense fell away entirely. He knew that I knew, and I knew that he knew I knew. We were two players in a game that had been interrupted 23 years ago, now facing each other across the same board with the same stakes. Except this time, the prize was Emma. The important thing, Alexander continued, his charm sliding back into place like a well-fitted mask, is learning from experience, making sure the people we love are protected from similar disappointments. When Emma returned, the conversation shifted to wedding plans. Alexander had already begun making arrangements, a small ceremony in the Berkshires, just family and close friends, followed by an extended honeymoon in Europe. Everything designed to separate Emma from her support systems while cementing his control over her life and career. We should discuss the prenuptial agreement soon, he mentioned casually. Just to protect Emma's interests, of course. Artists can be so vulnerable to exploitation. The following morning, I called my lawyer, Patricia Morrison, who'd helped me navigate the aftermath of Vincent's theft decades earlier. Patricia, I need you to research someone for me. Alexander Pemberton claims to be an art collector in Boston. What's this about, Alina? I think Vincent Ashford is back. Patricia's investigation revealed what I'd suspected. Alexander Pemberton had appeared in Boston's art world 18 months earlier with impeccable credentials and an impressive collection, but his provenance before 2022 was mysteriously thin. More disturbing were the parallels Patricia discovered in other cities. Sophisticated art collectors who'd courted young female artists, married them quickly, then disappeared with their money and work after tragic accidents during European honeymoons. Alina, Patricia said during our meeting, I found records of 3 similar cases in the past 5 years: Portland, Seattle, and Charleston. In each case, the woman was a rising artist from a wealthy family. In each case, she died in what appeared to be an accident within 6 months of marriage. I stared at the photographs Patricia had compiled, my hands trembling as I recognized the same predatory pattern I'd experienced but survived. He's not just stealing from them anymore. He's killing them. It appears so, and Emma fits the profile perfectly. Talented artist, family money, trusting nature. What can we do legally? Patricia's expression was grim. Without concrete evidence linking Alexander to these deaths, or proof of his true identity, very little. Suspicion isn't enough for criminal charges. That night, I sat in my study surrounded by the evidence of Alexander's crimes and my own past trauma. I thought about Emma's radiant face when she spoke about her fiancé. The way she'd begun deferring to his judgment about her own career. I remembered my younger self, equally infatuated with Vincent's charm and expertise, equally willing to believe that love meant surrendering control. but I also thought about the strength I'd developed in the decades since, the wisdom earned through loss and betrayal. I'd spent 23 years learning to read people's true motivations, to recognize manipulation disguised as care. Most importantly, I'd learned that sometimes protecting the people you love requires taking risks that seem impossible. I picked up my phone and called Emma. "Grandmother, it's late. Is everything all right?" "Emma, darling, I need to tell you something about Alexander, about who he really is." The conversation that followed was the most difficult of my life. Emma's disbelief turned to anger as I shared Patricia's findings, her accusations of jealousy and interference cutting deep, because they echoed my own fears about appearing to be a bitter old woman who couldn't accept her granddaughter's happiness. "You're wrong," Emma said, her voice cold with fury. "Alexander warned me you might try to sabotage our relationship. He said older women sometimes struggle with younger women's success and happiness." The manipulation was perfect. Alexander had anticipated my intervention and prepared Emma to reject it, turning my attempt to protect her into proof of his narrative about my motives. "Emma, please just listen." "No, grandmother, I won't let you poison my happiness with your paranoia. Alexander loves me. He's nothing like whoever hurt you in the past." She hung up, and I knew Alexander had won the first round. But unlike 23 years ago, I wasn't fighting alone this time. I called Detective James Crawford, Patricia's contact in the Boston Police Department, who specialized in art fraud and had been quietly investigating the suspicious deaths in other cities. "Detective, I think our pattern killer is here in Boston, and he's about to marry my granddaughter." Here, where the story shifts from survival to strategy. "Mrs. Whitfield, I understand your concern, but we need evidence, not suspicion. What if I could get you evidence? What if I could make him reveal his true intentions?" Crawford was quiet for a long moment. "That would be extremely dangerous. If this man is responsible for 3 murders, confronting him directly could put you at risk." "I'm 74 years old, detective. The worst thing that can happen to me is watching him destroy Emma the way he destroyed me." The plan we developed was deceptively simple. I would approach Alexander directly, claiming to have uncovered his true identity and threatening to expose him to Emma. The hope was that his ego would compel him to confess, believing he could manipulate or eliminate an elderly woman who posed a threat to his carefully constructed life. 3 days later, I met Alexander at a small cafe in Cambridge, wearing a wire provided by Detective Crawford and his team positioned nearby. He arrived punctually, impeccably dressed, wearing the same confident smile I remembered from both his incarnations. "Linger," he said, kissing my cheek as if we were old friends. "How lovely to see you again, though I must say Emma mentioned you haven't been feeling well lately." The seed of doubt he was planting, questions about my mental state, my reliability as a witness, was expertly done. "I'm feeling quite well, Vincent." His coffee cup paused halfway to his lips, but his expression remained perfectly composed. "I'm sorry, I think you called me by the wrong name." "Did I? How careless of me. Though I suppose after 23 years, it's natural to confuse Vincent Ashford with Alexander Pemberton, especially when they're the same person." He set down his cup with deliberate care, his movements controlled and precise. "I think you might be confusing me with someone else, Linger. Perhaps we should call Emma and clear this up." "Oh, I don't think Emma needs to be involved in our conversation. Not yet, anyway." I opened my purse and placed Patricia's research photos on the table between us. "Tell me, do these women look familiar? Sarah Winters from Portland, Lisa Chen from Seattle, Rebecca Torres from Charleston." For the first time, Alexander's mask slipped slightly. His eyes moved over the photographs with what looked like genuine recognition, possibly even fondness. "I'm afraid I don't know what you're suggesting." "I'm suggesting that you've expanded your business model since you stole from me. Instead of just taking their money and disappearing, you're taking their lives." "That's a serious accusation, Linger. One that could be considered defamatory if you shared it with others. The police are very interested in the pattern these deaths represent. especially when connected to your previous identity as Vincent Ashford. Alexander leaned back in his chair, studying me with the same intensity he'd once brought to evaluating paintings. You know what I've always admired about you, Alina? Your intelligence. Even 23 years ago, you were sharper than most of my clients. The admission was subtle but clear. He just confirmed both his identity and his view of women as transactions rather than people. Which is why I'm surprised you think you can threaten me and walk away unscathed. I'm not threatening you, Vincent. I'm giving you an opportunity to leave Boston voluntarily before the police arrest you. His laugh was soft and genuinely amused. My dear woman, what evidence do you think you have? 3 tragic accidents in different cities. A theoretical connection to a man named Vincent Ashford who disappeared decades ago. Even if you could prove I was Vincent, which you can't, what crime have I committed in Boston? Falling in love with your granddaughter. The confidence in his voice made my blood run cold, because he was right. Without concrete evidence of murder or fraud in Massachusetts, the police couldn't touch him based on suspicions about deaths in other jurisdictions. Emma will never believe you, he continued, his tone almost conversational. I've spent months preparing her to dismiss exactly this kind of accusation from you. She already thinks. You're becoming paranoid and jealous. If you persist with these wild theories, she'll be forced to cut contact with you entirely. And that's what you want, isn't it? To isolate her completely. I want Emma to be happy, free from the toxic influence of people who would poison her against the man who loves her. The psychological manipulation was breathtaking in its sophistication. He'd turned my love for Emma into toxicity, my protection into poison, my wisdom into paranoia. Every weapon I might use to save her had been transformed into proof of his narrative about my motivations. What happened to those women, Vincent? Alexander, he corrected gently, and those women lived beautiful. Albeit brief, lives with men who cherish them completely. Not everyone is fortunate enough to experience perfect love, even temporarily. The clinical detachment in his voice, as he described murder as a gift, made me realize I was dealing with someone far more dangerous than the art thief who'd stolen from me years earlier. Vincent had evolved into something monstrous, a collector of lives rather than just paintings. Emma won't be as easy to control as you think. Won't she? She's already signed papers transferring her trust fund to our joint account. After we're married, I'll have legal access to everything. Her money, her art, her career decisions. And she'll be grateful for my guidance, especially after the tragic accident that claims her bitter grandmother who couldn't accept her happiness. The threat was delivered with such casual elegance that it took a moment to register fully. He wasn't just planning to kill Emma during their honeymoon. He was planning to eliminate me first, making it look like grief over my death had contributed to Emma's subsequent accident. You won't get away with it, I said, proud that my voice remained steady. My dear Alina, I already have. Emma believes I'm her salvation. You're about to suffer an unfortunate fall down your brownstone's steep stairs, and in 6 months, a grieving widower will disappear with his late wife's assets to begin a new life somewhere else. Detective Crawford chose that moment to approach our table, his badge visible as he pulled out the chair beside me. Mr. Ashford, or should I say Mr. Pemberton, you're under arrest for conspiracy to commit murder. The change in Vincent's expression was fascinating to watch. The mask of cultured charm dissolved completely, replaced by something cold and calculating that I imagined his victims had seen in their final moments. That recording won't be admissible in court. This was entrapment. The recording is just for our entertainment, Crawford replied, placing handcuffs on Vincent's wrists. The admissible evidence is in your apartment, correspondence with art dealers in 3 cities, financial records showing payments to forgers, and most interestingly, a detailed journal documenting your methods for selecting and eliminating victims. As they led Vincent away, he looked back at me one final time. She'll never forgive you for this, Alina. Emma will always wonder if she was truly in danger or if you destroyed her happiness out of spite. 3 months later, Vincent Ashford, alias Alexander Pemberton, alias Marcus Sterling, alias David Worthington, was sentenced to life in prison for 4 counts of first-degree murder. The evidence Crawford's team discovered painted a picture of a serial killer who had been perfecting his methods for over 2 decades, viewing each victim as both a financial opportunity and a work of art to be possessed completely. Emma's forgiveness came slowly, in fits, and starts over many long conversations in my living room. The hardest part was helping her understand that her love hadn't been foolish, that Vincent's ability to manufacture genuine-seeming emotion was a skill honed through years of practice. She'd fallen in love with a carefully constructed performance designed specifically to exploit her particular vulnerabilities. "How do you trust anyone after something like this?" Emma asked during one of our talks, her voice raw with the kind of disillusionment that comes from discovering the depth of human evil. "You learn to trust carefully," I told her, thinking of my own journey from Vincent's victim to his nemesis. "You develop better instincts. You listen to the people who love you when they express concerns. Most importantly, you remember that real love doesn't require you to abandon your own judgment." Emma returned to her art with a fierce intensity, creating a series of paintings that explored themes of deception, manipulation, and the masks people wear. The work was dark but powerful, and it found an enthusiastic audience among collectors who appreciated art that confronted difficult truths about human nature. A year after Vincent's arrest, Emma met David, a fellow artist who shared her studio space. I watched their relationship develop with the protective vigilance of someone who'd learned to recognize both genuine affection and skilled performance. David was patient with Emma's wariness, respectful of my role in her life, and most tellingly, he encouraged her independence rather than seeking to control it. When Emma brought David to meet me, she was nervous in a way that reminded me painfully of her introduction to Vincent. But this nervousness was different, the anxiety of someone who desperately wanted approval rather than the blind confidence of someone who'd already been convinced that approval was irrelevant. "Grandmother," Emma said, taking my hand as we sat in my living room, "I'd like you to meet David Harrison. He's the reason I've been able to paint again." David was tall and gentle, with kind eyes and the slightly scattered appearance of someone more concerned with creating than impressing. When he spoke about Emma's work, his admiration was specific and technical rather than sweepingly romantic. When Emma excused herself to make tea, he didn't use the opportunity to establish a private connection with me or seek my approval for his plans. Instead, he said simply, "Emma told me about what happened with Alexander. I want you to know that I understand why you'd be cautious about anyone new in her life. I hope I can earn your trust over time." It was exactly the right thing to say, acknowledging the situation without drama, respecting my protective instincts without trying to circumvent them, offering patience rather than demanding immediate acceptance. 2 years later, when David asked for my blessing to propose to Emma, I gave it gladly. Their wedding was a celebration of art, community, and the kind of love that strengthens rather than diminishes the people it touches. Emma glowed with happiness, but it was the happiness of someone who remained fully herself rather than someone who'd lost herself in another person's vision. As I sit here now at 74, watching the morning sun illuminate the paintings Emma gave me, her own work mixed with pieces from Charles's collection that I've slowly recovered over the years, I think about the different forms wisdom can take. Sometimes it's the patience to let people make their own mistakes. Sometimes it's the courage to intervene when those mistakes could prove fatal. Vincent Ashford taught me that love without vigilance is just vulnerability. But Emma and David have taught me that vigilance without trust is just fear. The art is learning to distinguish between the two, to protect without smothering, to guide without controlling. I keep Vincent's photograph in my desk drawer, not as a memento, but as a reminder. Evil often wears beautiful faces and speaks in elegant words. It preys on our deepest longings, for love, for purpose, for someone who sees our value when we can't see it ourselves. But real love doesn't require us to surrender our judgment or abandon our connections to the people who have always cared for us. The power to protect the people we love isn't always gentle. Sometimes it requires us to be the villain in someone else's love story, at least temporarily. Sometimes it means accepting that gratitude may never come, that understanding may arrive too late to matter. But wisdom, I've learned, isn't about being right. It's about being willing to act on incomplete information when the stakes are too high to wait for certainty. It's about recognizing that some battles must be fought not because victory is guaranteed, but because surrender is unthinkable. In the end, Vincent was wrong about one thing. Emma did forgive me, completely and without reservation. Not because she understood immediately that I was right, but because she came to understand that love sometimes wears the uncomfortable face of unwelcome truth. The evening light is fading now, casting long shadows across my living room. Soon Emma will arrive for our weekly dinner, probably bringing paint under her fingernails and stories about her latest commission. David will follow later, carrying flowers from their garden and sketches of the sculpture he's working on. They'll sit at my table and share their plans, their worries, their small victories and daily defeats. They'll ask my opinion about career decisions and family matters, not because they need my permission, but because they value my perspective. They'll leave knowing they are loved unconditionally but not uncritically, supported completely but not without expectations. This is what victory looks like when you're 74 and have learned to recognize the difference between love and possession, between protection and control, between wisdom and fear. It looks like a quiet evening with people who chose to trust you with their real selves rather than performing an elaborate fiction designed to manipulate your emotions. Vincent collected beautiful things because he couldn't create them himself. He possessed women because he couldn't earn their genuine love. He destroyed lives because he couldn't build anything lasting or meaningful. But love, real love, multiplies rather than diminishes. It creates rather than destroys. It builds connections rather than severing them. And sometimes, when you're very fortunate, it gives you the chance to pass on the hard-earned wisdom that might spare someone else the lessons you learned through loss. The doorbell rings, and I hear Emma's voice calling out her arrival. In a few moments, my living room will fill with laughter and conversation, with the comfortable noise of people who belong together. Vincent wanted to silence that noise, to isolate and control and ultimately destroy it. And that's the victory he could never steal. The sound of life moving forward, louder and stronger than his silence ever could be. Instead, it grows stronger every year, a reminder that some things are worth fighting for, even when the battle seems impossible to win. Especially then. The art dealer's daughter is safe. The grandmother's vigil can finally rest. Thanks for listening. Don't forget to subscribe and feel free to share your story in the comments. Your voice matters.